Yo, did you hear that they legalized the purge in Illinois? So that's actually fake news being spread on social media in order to smear a really meaningful piece of criminal justice reform.
Right-wingers are always trying to fearmonger about crime, and this case is no different.
What do you mean? Do you know how bail works? No, not really. So right now, let's say you get charged for a crime. Not convicted, not proven guilty, just charged. For a lot of charges, you can get placed in jail until your trial, which can be weeks or months away. For many charges, you can opt to pay bail, which is basically the same as a security deposit in an apartment. You get the money back as long as you show up to the trial. But the thing is, you can't pay bail if you're poor, and that's disproportionately true for people of color. Money bail just lets rich people skip out on jail and imprisons poor people unnecessarily. So Illinois got rid of money bail. Whoa, so this is the purge. You're basically letting murderers and rapists run free. No, let me finish. The court can deny people pretrial release if they're charged with non-probational forcible felonies such as but not limited to kidnapping, arson, human trafficking, and SA, as well as other crimes like stalking, domestic battery, or sex crimes that pose a threat to the community or an individual. The SAFE-T Act, which is the name of this law that everyone's going crazy about, changes the system so that instead of everybody getting put in jail before their trial, a judge considers all the information for each case and determines whether or not someone should be detained until trial. Suspects can still be jailed pre-trial if they're considered a public safety risk or likely to try and skip town. Damn, I didn't know that.
So this TikTok by Flying Trash Bag points out how the reaction to bail reform has really gone over the top, and people have been using it to fearmonger about like, oh my goodness gracious, but what if these violent criminals get let out into the streets? But fail to recognize the core issue. The core issue is our current system is racist, and our current system is classist. It is one that very often puts people in positions that are incredibly difficult. Because first and foremost, we need to understand that jailing people is a predatory tactic that police use, and they really love to use because it becomes easier to force people into plea bargains. Because when you put somebody into a desperate situation, it becomes far easier to negotiate with them about the terms of their eventual release. And so police officers really love it when people are jailed before their trial to force confessions even among innocent people who are simply hoping to get everything over with as soon as possible so that they can get back to work and don't lose their jobs and apartments, or maybe even lose financing to support their families. Quite literally, pre-trial jail is a tool that is very often used to throw people into just complete economic desperation, and it turns out that people will do basically anything to avoid it. Now the problem is that with a cash bail system, working class people are more easily entrapped by this, and wealthier people who can afford the bail can pay that bail, not worry about it, and then get a lawyer so they don't have to worry about all of that plea bargaining nonsense. You see, there are multiple layers to this. First and foremost, obviously incredibly rich, privileged folks don't want to lose the impact of that wealth and privilege. They always want to pay bail, no matter how terrible the crime they might commit is. And then, of course, you have the reality that in general, wealthy capitalists and privileged people love having power over marginalized people and love the idea that they could call the police, have somebody jailed, and either cost them a ridiculous amount of money or cost them their freedom and potentially their livelihood. Then, of course, you have our predatory prison system, which really wants people to find their way into prison so that they can sell off that prison labor to private corporations, so that those private corporations can make money off of that labor, which really brings in another element that we need to understand. There's a lot of business interests in maintaining the predatory nature of our criminal justice system. They are deeply invested in ensuring that we can imprison as many people as humanly possible so that they can get slave labor for their workplaces. It actually turns out that it's very good for profits to rent out people who are imprisoned as opposed to, hiring people. And that is a huge part of the United States economy. So of course, there's a lot of people that are terrified that if we get rid of cash bail, and then if we actually tie pre-trial imprisonment and release to the potential of somebody committing a crime or being a risk to the community, that it might make it harder to use things like plea bargains to force people into the prison system. Which is why you have so many people in the media who work for these corporations, whether it be directly because their media company is owned by a giant corporation or through their advertisers, keep pushing this narrative about crime and how crime is skyrocketing, when the reality is that crime really isn't skyrocketing. Crime is kind of all over the place right now. Some crimes are happening more, some crimes are happening less. But in reality, if you compare where we're at now to where we were like 20 years ago or 30 years ago or even 40 years ago, crime is actually near historic lows that it has hovered at for the past decade or two. And then there's another political reason for this. Right-wingers love to fearmonger about crime because when people are afraid, they tend to behave more selfishly. If you are concerned about your individual personal survival today, you're going to be thinking less about things like climate change. You're going to be thinking less about marginalized people. You're going to be thinking less about investments in education or infrastructure and things like that, which is why they are constantly harping on crime and why they're spinning racist narratives about it. It turns out that these right-wingers are fascists and they want nothing more than to criminalize the existence of marginalized people in our country. And so, constantly making people terrified of crime, even though the United States is pretty much as safe as it's ever been, is a really easy way to do that. And even a lot of people who say that they might be on the left find themselves trapped by this very often and will very often fall into this line of thinking. But we have to ask ourselves, if crime is our biggest concern, what is causing it? What is causing what crime does exist within the United States? Well, most crime, believe it or not, shouldn't even really be crime. We're talking about these nonviolent drug offenders that are jailed for really no reason other than the profits mentioned earlier. And that is a huge, huge chunk of the crime that exists in the United States. Then you obviously have things like burglary, theft, larceny, murder, assault, you name it. Now, a lot of those crimes are crimes of desperation and poverty that often stem from a lack of mental health care that exists, from a lack of monetary and welfare support systems that exist for people, and a general sense of desperation and lack of community connectedness that causes these problems, which means that the solutions are relatively simple. The solutions mean getting better access to healthcare for everybody, which would be like universal healthcare, guaranteeing things like housing so that people are not literally desperate to survive, and then putting in place, workplace protections so that people have more free time so they can be a part of a community and actually engage with other people so that their relationships are far less likely to be harmed by a lack of connectedness to other people. We have to understand that the United States has the largest prison system in the entire world. If there is such a thing as an authoritarian police state, the United States is the most authoritarian, most police state that has ever existed in world history, and that is clear by the numbers. So, if putting more people in prison was going to solve the problem, it already would have. So all of this is to say, these right-wingers are fear-mongering. They're fear-mongering with the purpose of making profits and pushing their fascist agenda. We should not engage in that. We should not allow ourselves to be dictated by fear. We should be driven by hope that a better world is possible. We should aim to eventually live in a society that doesn't need a prison system, and then we should create the conditions that prevent crime before it happens so that we can one day get to the point where a prison system is unnecessary. And this reform, getting rid of cash bail, which by the way is a system that most countries around the world do not have because of how obviously unfair it is just one small reform within that to hopefully change the mindset around crime more broadly.